we are so good at branding our colleges, at branding our presidents and all of that. But when it comes to really branding the profession itself and the role that it plays in an organization, I think that's something that we fall short in.
You're listening to The Higher Ed Marketer, a podcast geared towards marketing professionals in higher education. This show will tackle all sorts of questions related to student recruitment, donor relations, marketing trends, new technologies, and so much more. If you're looking for conversations centered around where the industry is going, this podcast is for you. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast. I'm Troy Singer, and as always, I'm with my co-host and Soapbox Derby champion, Bart Kaler, where every week we attempt to glean what we can get from high-functioning higher ed marketers for the betterment of the entire community. This week, we're going to talk to Terri Giltner. She is the CMO of the Kentucky Community and Technical College System. And what we're going to talk to her about today is how to communicate and prove the value of higher ed education and marketing outcomes.
Yeah, Troy, I think it's a great episode. I'm really excited to listen to this. And, you know, I don't have a tremendous amount of experience in community colleges, so I always love talking to Terri or Jeff Fanter we've had on the episode before as well. But I think it's very interesting because even though sometimes we all look at it and say, well, there's publics, there's privates, there's community colleges, in essence, we're all doing the same type of work. We're all rowing in the same direction. And sometimes that is in communicating the value of higher education and doing that through outcomes, doing that through understanding affordability and communicating that well. I think Terri has some really good points and some really good articulation of how they're doing that in her system that I think would be very applicable to just about everybody.
Let's jump into our conversation with Terri. It's my pleasure to welcome Terri Giltner to the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast. Terri, thank you so much for being a guest with us today.
Thank you so much. I am really honored.
Well, we are honored to have you. And before we get into our topic of discussion, which is communicating and improving the value of higher education and marketing outcomes, would love for our audience to tell us a little bit about your marketing background and then also a little bit about the organization.
Sure. I started in marketing. I don't even want to tell how many years ago. This isn't my first rodeo, as the commercial says, but many, many years ago. I grew up in marketing through working at Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I did all things there. I was there about 10 years and did field marketing, new product marketing, handled the national advertising for about 2 years.
Wow.
So did menu boards, so all across the board. But then I left a KFC to go with a new product developer company that I ran into when I was working on new products with KFC. And it was a startup, and we developed and helped market new products for restaurant chains. And I did that for about another 9 years. And then I had a life-changing event, and I kind of quit work for a little bit and called my mother up one day and said, listen, I'm just looking for something part-time. And she worked for the governor of Kentucky. And a week later, I was executive director of communications for the transportation cabinet. And that was that was a shock to get something so quickly like that, but also to step into state government, which those of you who have been in that is an alter universe that does not operate very much like the private sector. And I did that. I stayed in state government for a while, worked in transportation, which I actually loved it, and then was called over to the governor's office to be on his communication staff. And executive director of communications. And he was the governor that created the community college system in Kentucky. And so he did a huge higher ed reform as part of his platform, which really did change the state. And after I left him and he went out of office, I was able to get this job as head of marketing, chief marketing officer of the Kentucky Community and Technical College System. And to tell a little bit about us, what he did in higher ed reform is he took the community colleges that were part of the University of Kentucky. He took those away from them, and he took the technical colleges that were part of state government and combined them.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a shotgun marriage in many ways, but he felt like that was really important to our state to increase access. Kentucky has one of the lowest educational attainment rates, and he really knew he had to jumpstart this by providing more access and streamlining, because he didn't feel like the University of Kentucky really had the best interest of the community colleges in mind. They were focused on their research and their big programs, but not community colleges. They were using them a lot for fundraising and all of that. Mm-hmm. So it brought those two institutions together that had a similar mission. And it was the success of higher ed reform. He did a lot of other things as well, but it almost tripled the enrollment of community colleges, and it increased the number of credentials. We're up triple from what we've started. So it was a huge success for our state.
And how many schools are within the system?
So we have 16 colleges with 70 campuses at this point, and a yearly enrollment of about 108,000 students.
My goodness. So you are over a large marketing organization, and would love to get into the topic comparing your current higher education role to the past. Would love to know your perspective of where you think higher education is going, or, how it's progressed over the past few years.
Are you talking about the role of marketing in higher ed?
Yes, I am.
A complete shift. When I started here, and I've been here, I'm in my 17th year, I was not allowed to use the word marketing. It was a dirty word. It was associated with for-profit and businesses, and just not a term you could use. Also, when I was started, I would say that the focus at our colleges and at our system office was primary public relations. Almost everybody in the roles at the colleges were externalists, no background in marketing. And so that really was the focus. And I have seen since the 17 years I've been here now, that is totally switched, that we're really have a much broader focus in terms of what marketing is. And it encompasses all of the components, from PR still being one to advertising, recruitment, advocacy, all the way through. So a complete shift.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that it's changed so much? I mean, I think part of it is the nature of the nature of higher education. I think that it's kind of grown up a little bit. As you, Terri, I've been in higher ed marketing for a number of years, even though I came out of the private sector as well. Really decided when I started my firm that I wanted to focus on higher ed. And I think that you're right. I remember some of the initial conversations, even when we were developing websites for some colleges and universities in the late 90s. It's like, well, is this really something that is going to help us, get more students, or is it going to help us raise money? And you look now, and it seems like a silly question, but back then, I mean, there's a lot of that struggle between really understanding academia and then, the basics of business, of just knowing that, students in the seats are going to pay the bills, that are going to pay the salaries. I mean, there's just a basic business equation that needs to be done. And I think it's taken higher ed a little bit of time to kind of come around to that.
I agree. I will say, if you look back to the old 4 Ps, right, of marketing, I do think higher ed is still, particularly community colleges, are still stuck in the promotional end. They're starting to see how marketing really does impact the other 4 Ps in the business. Our goal has been to begin to link us to enrollment, because really, I think even when they were thinking more about marketing and branding, they expanded that definition. They were really mostly thinking about, I hate to use the word, making things look pretty and right, and communicating that way. And they weren't really, they really aren't directly linking the role marketing plays in accomplishing all of the organization's goals, including enrollment.
Yeah. I remember a recent episode we had with Ethan Braden, who's the chief marketing officer at Purdue University. He uses the phrase that, many times marketing is driven on campus, where, it's make it pretty by Monday and we need this by Thursday, versus being the drivers of the brand, drivers of the message, drivers of, what's important to the organization. So I think you've made a really good point about that.
There's an overall discussion within higher ed of the perceived declining value of higher education, and would like to know to what degree does that affect community colleges?
Well, it impacts them a great deal. In fact, we just finished doing a prospective student research study. We do one every 5 years. And it is about 3,000 interviews with both traditional students, that's junior and seniors in high school, and non-traditional students, along with teachers, guidance counselors, and parents. And we've been tracking the value of higher ed. And this was the 4th study that we have done. And we started these studies in 2006. And every year, their perceived value of higher ed has declined. And this last time was the biggest decline we have seen. We're just getting the top lines in right now. And what was particularly disturbing is the decline in the value among teachers and guidance counselors who really are setting the stage for those juniors and seniors coming out, but really those folks that, become adult learners as well. So it really, I think, is impacting enrollment all around it. It certainly has impacted community college enrollment. Our enrollment has been down for almost 9 years and really declined during COVID and has really not rebounded. So I think that whole value issue, along with the other factors we're facing in our economy, it's just been devastating. And it really is not just about cost. Cost is part of that value equation. But it's about, is it going to get me a job? And I think that it particularly impacts the students that enter our doors, because I think they, in particular, are more interested in that particular skill level that they're going to get that moves them onto a career pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that this reminds me a little bit of the conversation we had with Jeff Fanter from Ivy Tech here in Indiana, and I think you and Jeff know each other. I think that was our introduction. Jeff made a comment on the podcast, was just how important it is, and he was using the reference of community colleges, but I would argue that it would be all of higher education, how important it is for communicating and articulating outcomes. And just as you kind of talked about a little bit, the idea it's linking all of this to jobs and careers, and what is that return on the investment? Because many times, we can talk about, okay, well, if I have a choice of being able to, get a generic brand soda or, a name brand Pepsi or Coke, well, I might spend the extra for Pepsi or Coke because the return on the investment of the enjoyment is worth it. And there's a lot of other, things that are part of that brand that are kind of mixed into that. I think sometimes we have to start talking about that in terms of higher education and how we market higher education to make sure that those outcomes are demonstrating that return on that investment and being able to kind of really prove that through all kinds of means. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we switched all of our marketing, creative and efforts to be more outcome about 3 or 4 years ago, where instead of going on campus and interviewing current students and, under a tree with books and all of that, we were really interviewing our alumni and what that career had done for them, not just from a career point of view, but from a whole life point of view. Our brand statement is we are here to improve the quality of life, but really to make life better for Kentuckians. That's what we're committed to. So we're trying to show how we're making our students, our former students' lives better. And that is the feature in most of our creative and stories that we tell at this point. But absolutely. And we've also changed our web. Particularly our program pages, which we know are the first pages that people visit, to be more career focused, where they can see what the average salary is, what the careers are that are linked to those programs. All of that we've made a switch to show outcomes.
And I'm sure that you kind of talked about a little bit of that social proof that, sometimes the social proof has been the current students, but many times it needs to be those alumni who are experiencing those outcomes. But I'm guessing too, I think in our pre-interview, we talked a little bit about some of the social proof is even the employers that are, I'm employing your, graduates and tell me about how you're using that as well.
We are really trying to get more and more of our employers engaged in even our traditional marketing efforts to say that, they employed these employees and how successful they were in the careers. And I will say with most of those student stories that we're doing now, where we're talking to alumni, we interview their employer at the same time. And we have been doing most of these interviews at their place of employment, along with some of the things in their personal life. And so that really has been, I think, great. I think it's really important when we show some of our photos that we show that student with some kind of background that shows the employer they're working in and the career that they have.
Some kind of context that just
Yes.
kind of brings it all together. I think that's great. And then let's talk a little bit about affordability. I mean, we talked a little bit about, that return on investment and again, affordability. And I mean, there's always context with everything. And so, I talk to some schools and it's like, affordability means this, it's the cost per credit hour, things like that. But at the end of the day, I have found, and maybe you can kind of tell me from your perspective, I've found that a lot of times making sure that we talk about affordability in the language and in the ways that resonates the most with our prospective students, and whether they're traditional, with parents or with, significant others who are helping them make decisions, really being able to communicate that affordability and that return on investment is so critical. Is that something that you've also faced?
Yes. And if I wish I had the answer on how to effectively communicate affordability, that is really community colleges. One of their primary value propositions, right, is that we are lower cost than the rest, the other options that are out there. There's a lot more, as you know, to cost than just the actual ticket price of the education, and particularly among non-traditional students, all of those opportunity costs, the job that they have right now that maybe they can't go full time to go back to school. Maybe it is childcare, for a lot of our students in the rural area, just transportation, getting to and from the campus. So there's just so much involved in that cost factor that we really do, I think, have not really effectively identified the best way to market that.
Right.
And we're having huge discussions. In fact, we're going to go into some focus groups after this big study to really dig into that. When we say, what words can we use? How can we demonstrate to students affordability that resonates with them? And that is something we are really struggling with and trying to get to. To give you an example, we were doing some one-on-one interviews with prospective students. This was about 3 years ago. And we were asking about affordability, and we were asking about, their knowledge of, the four-year schools in our state and then community colleges. And they said, yeah, we realize that you all are cheaper, but you're still expensive. So, it's a hard one to get to.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that sometimes, for different audiences, and we've talked to a lot of different marketers here on the podcast, I think a lot of times there's different messages and different elements that are so critical for the particular audience that you're serving, whether it's, in your case, prospective students for community colleges, whether it's, faith-based schools, whether it's, other areas. Being able to communicate those distinctives, being able to communicate those elements, whether it's affordability or different things like that, in context and very distinguished from all of the other options, is really part of the challenge. But you're right; it's a secret sauce that everybody needs to do, but it's a very, very difficult one to do.
Yeah, it is. And some of the research that we're looking at right now, we know it's a very different message with the Gen Zers, kids coming out of high school, than it is with adults. We know with this new group that coming out of COVID, which is a totally different mindset than we've seen with high school students before, they're mostly living in today. They're not thinking about the future. So when we talk about the long-term benefits of an education, and so, you're investing this much, this is how much you're going to get out of it, that doesn't really resonate with them that much.
No.
And even we're finding even that young non-traditional students, so you're talking somebody that's like 20 to 30, they're that doesn't resonate with them either.
Right.
So yeah, it really is a hard one to get at.
Yeah.
As we wind up this show, we always ask this of our guests, Terri. Is there either a tip or a thought, a top of mind topic that you have that you can share that could be implemented right away from fellow CMOs or other marketers within higher education?
Well, I've thought a little bit about this. I think one of the things that is impacting the marketing profession in higher ed, the difficulty of all of us who are in marketing to market our own profession. Does that make sense? We are so good at branding our colleges, at branding our presidents and all of that. But when it comes to really branding the profession itself and the role that it plays in an organization, I think that's something that we fall short in. And it is pretty difficult because we're still kind of a fledgling discipline within the higher ed world. I think one of the first things that any marketer can do, and this is at any level, and I'm sure some of the very sophisticated 4-years like Purdue have already done this, is to develop a common definition of what marketing is at your institution and what it does. Back a couple of years ago, we started tackling this because, you walk and talk to any of our presidents, every single one of them had a totally different, well, not totally different, but a different view or definition of what marketing is and the role that it plays in the organization. So we have worked really hard, and this is something, it takes a little time, but not that much time. But we work collectively with all of our marketing folks at the college to come up with that common definition. And it's pretty detailed because it also goes into, here's our overarching role, but here's the way that we go about doing it. And it has really impacted our organization, kind of taken the blinders off. I hate to use that word. Maybe the lens that's a better word. The colored lens that some of our faculty and leadership had about marketing and allowed them to broaden and understand. And it's made a big difference from us. It's allowed us to kind of move into the recruitment and enrollment. We now have taken over responsibility for lead generation. That's a big leap for us, particularly at community colleges. But I think just getting everybody on board and on the same page of what marketing really is and what it does for an organization.
Thank you very much. And I 100% agree. If someone would like to reach out to you, Terri, what would be the best way for them to reach you be?
The best way is through my email. It's terri.giltner@kctcs.edu. I'm sure you all will show that, but that's the best way to get me. I respond to email really, really easily, quickly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for being our guest today. Bart, do you have any thoughts that you would like to end us with?
Yeah, I think that a theme's kind of emerged, at least for me, as I listened to a lot of what Terri talked about, and it kind of circles around value. Not only did we talk early at the top about just kind of the idea of what marketing brings to higher education, the value that it does, especially historically being more in the private area. But then, in the last 15, 20 years, higher ed has really started to embrace marketing and embrace those 4 Ps and traditional marketing principles. And so there's a value that comes out of that. And I think that value starts to, when marketers do their job correctly, the value is the schools see that value in that. And then I think also just communicating value in what we do as higher ed marketers in promoting the schools and representing the schools through the brand, outcomes, affordability, other things of really trying to communicate that value that we bring to an individual's life. I mean, Troy, you and I are both first-gen students, and we've talked about this before. It's like, the trajectory that our lives went on in a change by higher education, by, post-secondary education, those things make a difference. And there's a true value in our lives because of that. And I think Terri's done a great job of communicating and articulating that and how she's leading that with her school system. And then finally, I think that last thing that Terri said was so important is how do we also communicate the value of our own teams in marketing within the academia, within the at the level of the cabinet and different places of leadership. I think it's important that we articulate it for ourselves so that we understand this is who we are and this is what we do. We're not just the people who make things look pretty. We're the people who are actually driving the brand and that are making decisions to really impact the success of the organization. And being able to articulate that better, I think that's a very wise word from you, Terri. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
That closes this episode of the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast, which is sponsored by Kaler Solutions, an education marketing and branding agency, and by Think Patented, a marketing execution company specializing in personalized and customized outreach programs. On behalf of my co-host Bart Kaler, I'm Troy Singer. Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to The Higher Ed Marketer. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening with Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to leave a quick rating of the show. Simply tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Until next time.